You're listening to the Valley Current.
So anyway, welcome into the Valley Current. We have again Professor Rafael Chodos, because we've been talking about this question that we've been batting around informally, which is there a heightened fiduciary duty in a situation where there's an ongoing pandemic? And I've been arguing, sort of without a lot of legal support, that when the environment gets dangerous, fiduciary duties increase just by dint of leaders having to be more fiduciary and more transparent. And I support my argument with a couple of things that have happened recently, including the publication of Bolton's book, which you could argue is sort of a transparency tell-all. You could say it's a bunch of gossip. You could talk about it a lot of different ways. But was there some fiduciary duty on his part not to publish? They actually filed that claim, and they are pursuing that claim for damages in U.S. versus Bolton. And Rafael and I have issued, I think now 3 podcasts. They've all been very well received on what was happening in that case. We predicted what was happening mostly, and then we commented on what was happening. We're now in a more broad topic, sort of one level above, which is, well, is there sort of an ongoing heightened fiduciary duty that all leaders, CEOs, board members, trustees, officers, maybe even to some degree executives who are non-officers, maybe we'll talk about that too, because there's a lot of different hats that people wear, lawyers, accountants. I mean, we can go through all the various titles that people have. Do they have a heightened fiduciary duty because they're dealing with a situation where there's a lot of fragility and it's knowable and foreseeable and almost obvious? Or is it, hey, the law is the law, the standard is the standard, the environment really doesn't change any of it, and maybe we should bat that around a little bit? And you're the expert, because I put up a book all the time about the law of fiduciary duties. I have it right here. It's on the shelf. It's a beautiful book. Some 100 pages. So what do you think, Rafael?
Well, I think we need to distinguish between changes in the law and changes in the required behavior. The general law is that the fiduciary must act with reasonable competence up to a normal standard of care with respect to the trust that he has. As the circumstances change, that standard of care changes. But that's not a change in the law. That's just a change in the circumstances and what is required.
Right. You're saying the legal standard is the same. All we're doing is judging what is the level of competence that you must apply to this new environment that you have to adapt your competence to.
Not a change in the level of competence, but what does normal competence require in this environment? For example,
right.
I'm the CEO of a small company. I'm driving up to the parking lot, and all of a sudden the company catches on fire. So, this is an emergency. I didn't cause it, but I see it. Has my fiduciary duty changed? Or am I simply required under existing fiduciary duty rules to call the fire department and help whatever employees I can in the front lobby?
That just happened, by the way, in Stinson Beach, which I just came back from. Stinson Beach, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge along Highway 101, really becomes Highway 1.
Right.
There was an explosion due to a gas pipe that leaked, and it blew up like half the town. And the interesting part, the town has adjoining to it a fire department, and the guy who's the volunteer fire chief heard the explosion about a block away, and he started running to the sound of the crackling fire, because instinctually he said, look, I have the fiduciary role as the fire chief to lead all of the volunteer firemen and women, because it's a full genderless force. About 20 people raced to that fire, literally with no boots, no helmets on. They were running with their fire extinguishers in hand. Of course, it was a gas fire, so they have to use special equipment. They put that blaze out pretty fast, but of course the cameras were open because it was about 9 o'clock in the morning and people were milling about the town. on a nice, beautiful day about, I want to say a couple of weeks ago, and there are pictures online showing the fire. And what you're saying is, look, that environment changed, and he acted in that environment with appropriate competence to get to that fire within seconds. I mean, literally, that fire was being addressed probably the fastest turnaround that could ever be imagined. And there were no one was killed. I think a couple of people were injured, actually, is what I've heard. A few people were injured because there were some apartments above the either the restaurant or the office building or whatever it was that blew up. I think it was actually a restaurant and an office building. Both blew up from a leaky gas line or leaky gas tank because of propane that's still used in the town. So you're saying, look, the level of competence. But I want to say something. I remember Cardozo for that famous Meinhardt versus Salmon case where he said it requires the punctilio of highest level of ethics, or would you say highest level of competence? Or like, I think of it as
ethical behavior. He was talking about the duty to disclose and the duty not to set his own interests ahead of those of the Sestuit.
Right.
The Meinhardt v. Salmon case.
Yes, and explain
this
what
was not a discussion.
Explain what the Sestuit is too, because we may be dealing with people who don't.
He's the one who's the beneficiary of the trust. In other words, the fiduciary. We have to remember in fiduciary law we've got a three-place predicate: A, B, C. A owes fiduciary duty towards B with respect to C.
Right.
C is what's called the race, and B is the guy who's called the Sestuit.
Yes.
And unless you can identify the three elements, you don't have a real fiduciary duty. And that's why there's so much confusion around, for example, the question of whether the President of the United States is a fiduciary. Who's the Sestuit? And what's the race? It's not 100% clear.
Well,
but in the case,
isn't that the notion of the people, this concept of the people?
But the people is a notion. It's a construct.
Right.
It doesn't have indigestion. You know, it's all right, and it's a convincing construct, but we have to remember that the law we're talking about that's what's interesting to me. I believe COVID is changing the world. I think it's wonderful that it's changing the world. It's changing our consciousness, and I think that's wonderful. But certain aspects of law don't change that quickly and shouldn't. They're supposed to be eternal. They're supposed to be adaptable to a wide range of changing circumstances.
Well, let me give you an example of something that comes up all the time these days in startup companies, because I think it's equally complicated to this situation of the President of the United States, the people, and Congress, and who to report to and all that jazz. So these days, when investors go into a startup, they typically don't buy stock. They loan money first as a convertible note.
Right.
They're wearing the hat of a lender. Typically, a lender is not a fiduciary, typically, but you may correct me on this, but typically a commercial lender is not a fiduciary.
That's true.
Right? Okay, but the tricky part is the lender is the VC who typically tells the founder or founders, I'm going to come on your board of directors and I'm going to lead the conversion of the note into the preferred Series A round. And I'm going to take a fiduciary role. So you really shouldn't worry about me being a big, nasty lender. This is just the convenience for setting the equity price in a way that's fair to you. At the same time, of course, there could be double dealing, because if the venture fails, the assets may go to this commercial lender, particularly if the lender says, hey, I think I should get a security interest in IP and all the assets. So now here's the question. When that person is on the board and stays on the board, can they somewhere in this say if the company gets into the zone of insolvency, their role is now as a board member to protect the lenders, which is also them? Or do they have to put the preference principle in the direction of, no, there's still a chance that the equity holders can actually pull this rabbit out of a hat? And
I
support it.
I would vote for the second option.
Right. This happens all the time, and venture people are not wise to it. They think they can have multiple hats at the same time and skate around the fiduciary duties. This is coming up more and more.
Well,
and some people really think the law needs to change in the direction to allow them to have 1 foot in as lender and 1 foot still in as director, and sometimes even as an officer of the company.
Well, let me know when one of these cases comes up, because I'd love to litigate it. The fact is, there's a conflict of interest there.
Right.
And of course, you haven't told me all the facts. Example, are there other lenders? Are there other secured lenders? And how many shareholders are there?
Right.
Those are all relevant facts.
Right.
Taking a typical situation, assuming there are other lenders and many shareholders, this lender comes in now with a conflict of interest.
Right. So he's got to put what you would say all of the stakeholders, the employees, the common shareholders, the other shareholders, maybe even the vendors, because there might be vendors that have some arguable priority, like maybe even the theoretical CPAs and the service providers, like the lawyers who are trade creditors, right?
Yes. It's a clever business plan to come in with a loan first, but it really postpones what's the word? It sort of deflates the risk, kicks it down the road, and that creates the conflict of interest.
Right. So when you look at the current COVID situation, because this really will focus our discussion, lots of board members believe they don't really have to do anything. The CEO, the CFO, the CLO, if there's a chief legal officer, they really just have to handle this, and they, report that they're doing things according to the rules, whatever the rules are. What's your view on that? Because there are lots of boards that might take the view that, hey, we just supervise things when there's really, something to be supervised, but this is down in the weeds, or some of them think it's down in the weeds, sometimes even with a couple of hundred employees. And of course, the employees, a lot of them are, hey, I'm not going back to work until it's 100% safe. And who knows when it's really going to be 100% safe, right?
Well, let's clarify our thinking. What do we want the board members to do in an ideal world? Let's suppose, for example, that the CEO tells them at board meetings, we're disinfecting the cafeteria very industriously. But it turns out they're not disinfecting the cafeteria, or it turns out that the people who are doing the disinfecting are being sloppy. And some employees, while eating lunch, although social distancing, get COVID-19. Is there any liability against the company, against the CEO, against the board? What do we think?
Well, I could tell you that the board members want to believe that the CEO is going to carry out the right plan, and that the CEO is backed by the building manager, because typically there's a building separate vendor who's selling building services or space facilities and services. And they want to believe it all kind of comes down to that manager of the HVAC system and the building, because some cleanup is happening of the building. But you might say there's shared responsibility across the board. That's the question that I'm raising about what's the heightened level. You're saying the standard for competence is the same, but what factually must be done changes with the environment, because a sinking or burning ship has a different environment than one that's beautifully running with lots of wind in its sails, right?
And, I'm trying to think, should a board member say, excuse me, let's adjourn this board meeting. I'm going down to the cafeteria to check it.
Well, I could tell you when I serve as a board member, which I rarely do because of the potential for liability, I do sometimes show up unannounced. Like I will, if I happen to be in court and I've got a company that's in San Francisco and I'm in court in San Francisco and the court hearing ends early, I'll just knock on the front door and say, let me in, because I have the right to come in. I have the unqualified right to inspect. Right. And a lot of times a CEO gets upset. What are you doing here? I said, I just come in to say hello. Hey, by the way, I brought you a cup of coffee. Can you sit down for 5 minutes? Of course, they're usually disarmed by that. Because you're bringing them a cup of coffee and they say, is there something going on that I don't know about? Because of course they want to be pre-alerted to everything and pre-scripted to everything.
Right.
This show, there's no pre-script. And I literally come in and I sit them down and look them in the eye and say, what is it that I hear? Whatever it is that I've heard from whoever I've heard from, might be mostly gossip, saying, hey, we're losing some customers that we shouldn't be losing. You know, something went sideways. And, you know, sometimes you do hear that. And if you are a really curious person like I am, you don't want to hear the standard bullshit that someone's going to write up into some PowerPoint. You want to look them in the eye before they even know what the issue is.
Correct.
And have them say, we lost that customer. I had no idea. Even that represents valuable information. They had no idea. And here I am 6 or 7 steps removed, and I hear it through a long, long grapevine. Right. You might say that CEO doesn't have his or her hands on the wheel, right?
I agree. That would be a breach of the duty of management that the CEO has, not to be on top of sales, customer relations, finances, etc., and health precautions for the company of various kinds.
You know, most CEOs want to believe that they can delegate everything. Like literally, they can delegate everything to someone else, that their role as captain of the ship is barking out orders. They don't even have to have their hands on the wheel. The wheel has a wheelman or a wheel person. And literally, they're just there making the command decisions, you know, big command decisions, like Jamie Dimon, the guy that's the CEO of JP Morgan, you know, basically barking out, are we going to acquire Bank of America, or are we going to acquire, you know, Wells Fargo? Big orders. Everyone else takes care of everything else. Of course, you know, that can be a recipe for a disaster if it turns out that things go sideways. But conceptually, I think the law is a bit in disarray about what does the CEO have to do in this or any rapidly changing environment when the water really gets rough, because it's a new territory, right? It's no one knows what the new normal is anymore.
Let's back up for a minute. If I'm the CEO and I delegate a responsibility to you, am I relieved of that responsibility? Or do I simply have a cross complaint against you for failure to discharge it? I'm liable.
Yeah, I don't think you're relieved of anything. I think
neither do I.
Right? The buck doesn't stop with, you know, it's the old Ike statement that the buck stops with the president or the chief executive officer, right?
Right. In other words, you can delegate as much as you want, which is fine. You have to supervise the person to whom you delegated, and you still have the responsibility. You can't escape the responsibility by delegation. So in the COVID situation, everybody's on notice that special health measures are required. And of course, there's a whole other range of issues for companies that you would advise, such as pricing, contract modifications based on COVID. You know, what's rational, what works for the company, what doesn't work for the company. I think the CEO and the board have to get involved in that discussion and make decisions. And there's no guarantee that the decisions they make will be the correct ones. Certainly, if you have a company, for example, that has a real estate portfolio, that's a real humdinger these days, isn't it?
Well, if you have a real estate portfolio, it seems to me that you're bringing in lots of experts to sort of CYA you into what do we have to do in at least a dozen different areas: the floors, the ceilings, the HVAC.
No. Also, deferral of rent. What happens when your tenants can't pay? Which is a lot of tenants these days, commercial as well as residential. Well, what does the owner do?
Now, the owners are relying on getting some PPP type payments, but that's not going to last forever, right?
I never understood the whole concept of stimulus in response to COVID.
Well, it represents some sort of lubricant that's being thrown onto a rusty chain, right? I mean, the chain is rusted, right?
Well, it's not just that the chain is rusty, and lubricant is a good image, a good metaphor. The fact is it can't possibly last very long, because if people have to pay back the rent they skipped, that makes the problem worse.
Well, I think they're thinking there's going to be the equivalent of a rent moratorium, and the government's going to print a lot of money, maybe a lot more money if a phase 2. I mean, that's really where I wanted to get with this, which is there are definitely experts who are saying we are in the midst of a start of phase 2. And phase 2 is going to be 10 times worse, maybe 20 times worse, maybe 30 times worse, phase 1. And they're saying, look, phase 1 is like a small pimple. And phase 2 is going to be like cancer, like worse than acne, like really cancerous. And phase 3 is going to be like acne that's coming down to the pimple again. So we're going to have like this rolling kind of, jump. If you buy that view and you say that you have to brace yourself for a coming, tsunami that began because of a small hurricane, what do you do as a government? Because the government's got to solve this big problem, governments plural, and maybe to some degree, the world organizations, whether you call it the World Health Organization or you call it the United Nations, they've got to anticipate there's some percentage chance that some set of experts that say it's going to get that bad are right. What else do you have but throwing money at stuff like this to get something to happen? There's not a lot more that you have other than charitable work and money, right?
No. First of all, throwing money means printing money.
Printing money.
And what you're doing is shifting a huge burden to future generations.
Right. You're taxing the future. You might be taxing the present as well. The present.
Exactly. Yeah. And the other thing is, there are some people, I read some article, we should follow the Old Testament and have a general, a Jubilee year, where all contracts are voided. But that doesn't work for us in our society. It's a real problem. But is it a problem of fiduciary duty or just a general problem of planning and responding?
Well, let me give you a hypothetical just to end on, because we've gone through most of the session and probably not been as focused as I think we normally are, because this might be a 2 or 3 part discussion, because we're really in a hot area. I think it's extremely hot. I have CEOs calling me every day of the week saying, I really want people to go back to work because I think this is all overblown and we're not getting things done and products aren't coming out and the supply chain is really rusty and we got to get some lubricant on it and only key people. Maybe we start with a phased approach to key people first, and when they're 6 feet apart or 6 rooms apart or whatever it is. And they say, can I do that without liability? By the way, they're indirectly saying, can your malpractice insurance cover me if I'm wrong? Because I'm looking for you for advice. And we know that's not really what malpractice insurance is meant for. It's not meant to be some sort of overall blanket insurance for some company or his or her CEO. So you say, what advice do you give as the lawyer for the corporation asking, what do I do? I've got some employees that won't come in. I've got some that are willing. I don't know, can we have them sign a waiver? Can we get that? And would it be legal? What can we do? Do we have to use a Miranda warning? Do we have to use some sort of forward statement? Do we have to do temperature checks? Do we have to do this? Do we have to do that? What do you say to those people?
Well, and you bring up a related question, which I've been thinking about. If people who went to the Trump rally in Tulsa signed waivers, and then a large number come down with COVID, is there an action available against anybody?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but I can tell you that the CEOs are worried and the CEOs feel like they should not own this. This should be some expert, and they think the lawyers are experts, but the lawyers are not experts in this. They're even
not in this.
Lawyers.
Not in this. It's a very good question, and it's a difficult decision because it's a life and death for many companies. I'm driving around LA here, and I see a lot of companies that I recognize, and they're out of business. They're not coming back because this 3-month hiatus in earnings has been unsustainable.
Right. I mean, restaurants are closing left, right, and sideways. They just closed, get this, they just closed University Avenue, the main drag here. They closed the whole street because the restaurants are saying, we want to start serving outdoors or we're going out of business. We're going to have a ghost town in downtown Palo Alto. Downtown Palo Alto probably has literally 40 different restaurants, maybe 50.
I know. I love the place.
It's probably shrunk to maybe 20 right now. And the 20 are renting tables, like folding tables. Trucks are there. They closed the whole University Avenue. And the theory is we're going to let people serve outdoors 6 or 9 or 12 feet apart. They closed the whole University Avenue. So you cannot drive a car on University Avenue. You get diverted to go either to Hamilton or to Lytton. It's changing the whole traffic pattern. So the main drag has become like restaurant DeVille.
Right.
Goal is to hope that the weather stays decent. It's been decent up here, no rain. And they literally are assuming they're going to get the downtown folk to come back downtown. No cars. You have to walk, by the way. You're going to have to park and walk, which, of course, a lot of people won't do. And they're hoping the kids from Stanford, when they come back, which who knows when that's going to happen, will revitalize the downtown area. But no movie houses are open. So usually people would be able to go to one or of two or maybe several different places that show films. And they're now saying, you know, we just want to get people to come back for outdoor eating. Whether it's going to work or not is an open question.
I doubt it.
I mean, if it doesn't work, then the restaurants have to go furloughed until some future date, probably in 2021, assuming that the second phase doesn't even happen, right?
Right, assuming. No, it's a serious problem and we haven't figured it out. I keep trying to find opportunity in this situation, and I keep thinking about that. I'm not ready to talk about it right now, but there is some opportunity here.
Well, the
some positive.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's pretty obvious is that people have really made their homes true home offices. I mean, you and I probably have always had a home study because we work so hard, and you get home and you start a new brief or you start a new chapter to a book. You do it in your own study, so you're used to it. But a lot of people, they're using their kitchen table. They're trying to figure out how to divide the space among the different people who are in the household. They're learning how to adapt to this new environment.
Correct.
Where it's really shared space.
Correct.
And you know, you could argue there's some tax benefits that go with that. People are starting to learn about using those tax benefits.
Right.
But going back to the topic of what do you think we actually need a federal standard for fiduciary compliance that cuts across all 50 states? Because I bet the duty of care in Alabama is a little bit different than the duty of care.
Not really. And don't the federal guidelines put out by the CDC constitute what you're talking about?
I don't think they translate necessarily into preemption of a federal standard. That's what I'm wondering about, whether that needs to happen. In other words, if someone comes into court and says, I complied with the Federal Drug Administration notice for a pack of cigarettes.
Right.
Historically, the cases have said, well, in Alabama, we still have strict liability law. We don't care what federal law says. That's kind of an interesting little floor, but it isn't really a ceiling. You know, you basically just have to get jumped at and jump whatever our law is here in Mississippi or wherever the tort claim is brought. And that may be a very local thing, maybe even down to the local courthouse and the local judge that's deciding, you know, that particular negligence case, for example.
Well, that's a general problem of jurisdiction and preemption.
Right.
You know, I don't know. What you say is interesting. I don't know the law generally across all 50 states. But if the federal government promulgates guidelines and you comply with those guidelines, that should be protection against suits for failure to discharge your duty of management, duty of care.
Well, will it work as against, say, the view that some lawyer says in California we have a higher standard because we have all these additional regulations dealing with chemicals and pregnant women and, you know, all these things that you see, you know, on doors all over the place?
Well, we're talking about COVID.
Yes. COVID.
So the chemicals and pregnant women thing are in place already and were in place before COVID.
Right.
So if the allegation is that you failed to comply with those, that's not COVID related. But if it's COVID related, you know, of course, we have a huge problem with our federal government. They haven't promulgated national standards.
Right. That's what I'm asking. Is that a defect in kind of the current thinking?
I think it is.
Yeah. Should there be a proclamation that says, look, liability, I'm going to write this in real time and you're going to tell me now that's crazy or maybe that makes sense. Liability of a retail establishment, including a restaurant, is non-existent to the extent that there is compliance with the latest CDC regulations at the time that the event causing the infection occurs. Period, full stop. That's basically the law in all 50 states.
It sounds reasonable. I'd like to think about it a little bit and see if there are any real problems.
Right.
I understand California may come forward and say, oh, no, we didn't agree with those guidelines. They're inadequate.
Well, it's not only California. It could be county by county, because right now I could tell you Santa Clara County is still of the view that everything is closed. San Mateo County, everything is more or less open. The difference is literally less than a mile. You can walk from the Stanford campus north and you're in San Mateo County, you're in Menlo Park. I mean, literally it's not even noticeable. Like there's no sign that says you've entered San Mateo County. To find that sign, you'd have to look on a bridge that crosses a little creek. Literally, there's a creek that runs between the counties.
I know.
On the north side. And
I've swum in that creek many times.
Yeah, everyone operates like it's just part of Silicon Valley, period, full stop, even though there's different courthouses, there's different supervisors. And apparently the Santa Clara supervisors have been a lot tougher than the supervisors in San Mateo. And it's going to be an interesting question. Like, it's confusing. To be honest, it's actually confusing because if you ride a bicycle, you'll see restaurants open in Menlo Park serving indoors. And you'll say, okay, I guess restaurants are serving, but you come to Palo Alto and say, I'd like a seat at the table. Maybe it's drizzling. They'll say, we can't serve you. That's only takeout. And it's confusing for people. I mean, I can see why a lot of people are like, it's a mess. I mean, even within, say, a particular geographic area that you could argue Silicon Valley is as a region, because it covers like 5 counties at this point. So
let's keep our eyes open and see if any suits like this are actually filed on our next podcast.
Absolutely. So what I'm going to suggest to you is we take the last Friday at 11 a.m. each Friday, if we can do it.
Fine.
And put it on the calendar, and I'll send the general invite, and we'll cover what might be called fiduciary compliance or non-compliance, and maybe we'll even turn it into a named series like, the fiduciary litigation reporter or something, because we've done a lot between the two of us. I think we've got north of 100 years of fiduciary experience or close to it in litigation, in conflict, in counseling, in understanding the law. You're really the academic and the expert and wrote the book. I just get a lot of the cases that you help me in different and variety of different ways, which I so appreciate. You've been a great expert witness as well, and you've made a difference in a lot of cases because you bring kind of the calmness to a mediation of, look, let me give you an analogy, and then people just stop and are dead in their tracks. So I want to applaud you for that, because there aren't a lot of people like you anymore, Rafael. There really aren't. Not people that sit down and write treatises. They write blogs. They don't really do the deepness that you do in this area. So I want to applaud you for that.
All right. Well, thank you. And you keep calling me professor. I'm not
I know you teach, and I know that's good enough I know you've taught before, and I know you've done a lot of teaching through the book.
I have.
So I like to think of you as a professor and an expert in this area.
I'll grow a beard or something.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. But the Talmud and a few other sources of law that most people don't. So keep it up. Okay. I'll send you some stuff as we go along.
All right, I'll keep my eyes open.
All right, see you, Rafael. See you later. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Tune in next time on the Valley Current.